Hello guys, welcome to another video. And so in this particular video, we've just been having a discussion around front-end architecture, and I brought in Maxi to have this discussion with me. This is definitely going to be a very interesting conversation, and I've been really looking forward to this particular conversation with Maxi. Hi Maxi.
Hey there, how's it going?
Yes, going fine. Okay, I think we could quickly jump right into it. Maxi, can you just give us a quick introduction of yourself and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Maxi Ferreira. I am currently a front-end architect. I work at Help Scout, which we work on customer support software, and yeah, I've been here for a long time. I've always been a front-end developer since I started since the early stages of my career. I actually started working as a PHP developer during my first few years in the industry in the late 2000s or so, and then during the SPA era around 2010 or so, I moved into front end development. So I've been working with front end since then. So yeah, worked with a bunch of different frameworks over the years. Backbone was my framework of choice for a long time. Then I started
Wow,
using React. Yeah, started using React in like
amazing.
2014 or so, and then yeah, I continue to use React. Is
Wow.
still my main UI framework, I'll say, these days. But yeah, and then these last few years, I've been more involved into or more interested into the world of architecture and software design. So I moved into this new role, and I also started writing this newsletter last year, which is all about software design and architecture, but trying to put it on from a front end perspective, I should say. So yeah, that's basically me.
That is quite amazing because I think what caught my attention about your portfolio and your work out there was mostly front end at scale. And
Hmm.
the reason why I see front end at scale because like you said, right, it's actually targeting the market of like front end developers, but on a software architectural level, right,
Hmm.
pertaining to just front end developers. And and I think since getting to subscribe to the newsletter, it's really been an amazing journey for me getting to like get those emails from you, and yeah, getting those emails from you, and they are truly inspiring and makes me want to like go deep into front end architecture on the front end, which is quite amazing. So, like I said, I think we'll just be discussing about front end architecture on this particular series. And before we jump right into that, I just wanted to ask, so what really inspired front end at scale? Because, like I said, it's very unique, right? It's very unique. It's different from like a lot of newsletter or a lot of articles you get to receive on a weekly basis or bi-weekly or a monthly basis. Like it's quite different. So, like, what inspired front end at scale actually?
Oh yeah, thank you first of all for the kind words. I appreciate that you take the time to read the newsletter. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey this past year. It was recently the first anniversary of the newsletter, and I'm just super grateful for the support and the reception for the newsletter. I'm just super happy to see that. And yeah, it's interesting, the question of what inspired the newsletter. I think for a long time I just wanted to write. I wanted to write, to create more content. I think a lot of you probably can also relate to wanting to write more, to have a blog and write blog posts. And I struggled with that for a long time. I just couldn't get to schedule. I just couldn't stick to consistently writing blog posts on my own blogs. I thought that maybe committing to a newsletter would be like, say, okay, I have this deadline every 2 weeks. I have to write
Yeah.
something, so I have to do it. So it worked out in the end. It was a big commitment, but I made it work. And as for the actual contents of the newsletter, it was just the things that I was most interested at the time, and I continue to be interested now because I've always had I always like to read. I like to read books. That's one of my hobbies. I know it's a bit of a boring hobby, but it's it's one of the things I like to do. And
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
reading a lot about architecture, a lot about software design, and I was taking a bunch of notes. I like to read and take notes, and a lot of my notes were, how this architectural concept that I just read in this book that was written maybe 15 years ago, but
Wow.
how do I apply this to the front end? How do I translate this method to the front end layer? So I was writing notes about that for a long time, and then I said, okay, maybe I should write about this because I actually like these topics, and maybe other people will like them too. So I started writing about those, and it was in the beginning. It was mainly about high level concepts. I was talking a lot about complexity and a lot
Yeah.
about a lot about how you handle how do you scale your code base and so on. And so it's a lot maybe abstract because I was talking about abstractions. I was talking about design patterns and so on. Lately, I've been trying to bring it down to a lower level and talk a bit
Yeah.
about more about code as well. I don't want it to be all high level and all hand wavy advice. I wanted to actually bring like more practical advice. So I've been trying to bring it down to the code level as much as I can. But yeah, that's continues to be I continue to struggle with the contents of the newsletter. Every issue that I write, I have, will this be interesting to the readers or no? But yeah, it's a journey, I'll say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think for that, it's really been quite interesting because I always look out for like the issue every week, and I don't know, like all the issues that comes out every week. There isn't a miss. Like it's always right on point, and there's always new stuff to like get out and new stuff to learn. And yeah, that's really really solid. Okay, so cool. So you talked about how you love reading and you started thinking about putting out blog out there, but you were really not consistent with it. But you had to think about other methods to put out more to be more consistent with with putting out the articles and making them in the form of a newsletter. All right, all right. Okay, cool.
Hmm.
So let's quickly just jump right into front end architecture. So what is front end architecture? Because the word itself, right? Um, I'll I'll speak for other front end developers, right? They might be this back and forth about maybe the front end isn't really software or the front end is just UIs and just calling APIs and like I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say right now. So what does front end architecture means? Like what does it really mean? Yeah, like can you just give us a broad understanding of what the front end architecture is
Yeah.
before we dive right into it? Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's a great question because it's hard to define, and like you said, a lot of people don't even consider front end to be something that it's even related to architecture. Because when you think about the architecture of a software, you think about infrastructure a lot of the time. You think about how your servers work, how your the orchestration works, how your data layer works, and so on. And the front end is just like a small piece of that. It's just like a mini, like one detail of your overall architecture. So thinking of your front end as having its own architecture is definitely something that a lot of people don't like struggle with defining. And I also struggle with defining because it's just hard to define. But recently I've been working on this workshop which is about front end architecture. I
Yeah.
had to make an effort to define it because I can't have a work about something that I just can't describe. So
Exactly.
um,
Yeah.
and and the way that I like to describe it is that it's about the decisions that you make about the how you structure your front end layer. So this
Okay.
comes from a definition of software architecture that by Michael Killen. He wrote a great book called Design It. It was one of my favorite architectural books, and he defines architecture, software architecture, as the decisions that you make about how you structure your software to reach certain quality attributes. And the way that I like to use that definition to apply it to the front end as well. So it's the decisions that we make about how we structure and we organize the front end layer to comply with certain
Okay.
quality attributes. And these quality attributes are also a thing that I talk about in the course, which is that these are the things that you might know them as the ilities of your system. So this might be the maintainability, scalability, performance, or reliability, and
Performance.
so
Yeah.
on. and each application that you build will have different requirements, different needs in terms of quality attributes.
Exactly.
So your
Exactly.
architecture needs to promote those, right? That's why there's no silver bullet. You can't have like one architecture or one framework, one library that it's the best of them all, because there will always be different requirements and different quality attributes that you need to promote. So yeah, that's I guess the way that I like to describe it.
All right. All right.
Hmm.
All right. Okay. Cool. So, if you say that, right, because right now you talking about it and trying to break it down. To me, let's say, okay, for example, I'm a new front end developer, right?
Hmm.
And I'm kind of interested in architecture, and it sounds so complex right now to me because I'm actually hearing stuff like software designs, like I'm hearing complex stuff right now, complex jargons, right?
Hmm.
Which might seem very very advanced to me. So the next question mostly should just be how could someone get started, right, on like as a front end developer, how could someone get started? I have an interest for to go into front end architecture and to be mostly focused on it because, like you mentioned, it's very very important how you structure your code on the front end
Hmm.
and like how can I get started as a front end as a front end developer interested in architecture. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a fair call. A lot of the things that we talk about in architecture, they are very high level, and they might be hard
yeah,
to understand for someone who is new to the industry. Maybe they are a good developer. They're starting to work on front end, but maybe they work with the code all day, right? They write code and they understand certain high level concepts and abstractions. But it can be hard to zoom all the way out to the level, like
yeah.
let's say architecture. So my advice is to continue to focus on what I call your depth of knowledge, which is your expertise in a particular language or framework or part of the stack in your early years in your career. You want to stay as close to the code as possible and continue to develop your expertise on that. That will lead you to learn about things that are sort of intermediate between architecture and the code, which things like design patterns, for example. These are things that are straight. They are a level of abstraction above the code, but they're still closer to the code because you represent them in code as well. And that will lead you to how to organize your code base, and that will lead you to how you think about how do you come up with an entire project that promotes these quality attributes and so on. So I think it's just level. You just step up in terms of abstraction, and then you go
Yeah.
all the way out to this very general abstraction layer of the architecture. But yeah, like I said in the beginning, for people who are starting out, continue to dive deep into your expertise, your depth of knowledge on your particular framework or choice, and then at some
Mm-hmm.
point start to also to level up your what I call your breadth of knowledge, which is your knowledge of other adjacent areas, right? So
Yeah.
maybe as a front end developer, you don't need to be an expert on how a particular database works or
Yeah.
how backend frameworks work, but it's good to have an understanding of how they work,
Yeah.
at least at a very high level.
Yeah. So I think what so just to wrap up what you just said there, if you're just starting out, right, you just need to focus more on your on the basics, your fundamentals, and understand how each, for example, on the web, right, understand how the web works, understand how basic structures, right, basic structures,
Hmm.
your basic. Let's say, for example, you're working with JavaScript, understand how JavaScript works and how to make use of it. So if you're starting out, you shouldn't worry too much about thinking about the abstractions, thinking about architectures. Like those stuff are for like when you have a very deep understanding of your fundamentals before you could like dive into those. Okay, cool.
Hmm.
I think I could ask next, right? Okay. So I actually want to call it why front end architecture because like I mentioned firstly, um, I think for me, right, personally, I'm going to talk from my more personal experience, right? Before 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 getting to start consuming your content, right, which is mostly targeted to like front end architecture and stuff. I've been writing code, right? I've been writing production code. I've worked with like a lot of teams, and we've written codes, front end code that works, that actually that does the business logic, right? That brings in
Hmm.
the revenue and stuff like that. So getting to start consuming your content concerning front end architecture, I started seeing like an higher layer, right,
Hmm.
of how you could structure your front end. So now the question now is, okay, so why front end architecture? Because you could, correct me if I'm wrong, but like you could not really worry about front end architecture, like, and you could still build out good products, right or wrong?
Hmm.
Am I right or
Hmm.
wrong? Yeah, yeah. So like,
Yeah,
why front end
absolutely.
architecture? Why front end architecture? Why should a front end developer be concerned about it, or why should they have an understanding of it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a very good question because it's a lot of the comments, or well, not comments necessarily, but I know that a lot of people have this feeling that architecture is really not necessary, right? It's just
Mm,
uh, I can jump directly to the code, and why should I bother about the architecture? And I think part of this is the some bad rep that architecture has, that comes from the the waterfall era of architecture, where architecture was done by someone who was an architect or a software designer, and his job or her job was to be isolated on the ivory tower, crafting architectures, and then it will hand off the architecture to developers to implement. But of course, that model doesn't work anymore. That we
yeah.
know that being these big architectures up front is just a recipe for disaster, because it doesn't allow you to incorporate all of the learnings that you make while writing the code back into the architecture. It's just you define the architecture in the beginning, and then when you start coding, if you realize that something is wrong, then, well, you have to deal with that, because you can't change the architecture. Now, of course, architecture nowadays, modern architecture is it works much more in iterations. So you do a bit of the architecture,
Okay.
you do a bit
Okay.
of the code, and then you iterate, and then you
Okay.
do a bit more architecture, a bit more code, and then you iterate. So
Okay.
it's much more agile in a way, right? And so I think when it comes to architecture, doing a big upfront design, these big architectures upfront, and spending a lot of time coming up with the architecture before you start coding is not really the way to go. What you want to do is spend a bit of time at the beginning defining your architecture, making sure you understand the problem and how your architecture will solve that problem, and then start coding. And then as you learn more stuff while start coding, go back to a drawing board, refine your architecture, and continue to code and work like that. And so as a person who might be on the architect's role, maybe you don't have the title of architect, but maybe you are a tech lead, maybe you are a team lead or something like that, and you're
Yeah.
responsible for defining the structure of your system. You want to work with your team. You want to continue to write code. You want to continue to support the team during the implementation. And then, as you realize that your architecture needs some refinements, then you go back to a drawing board, work on the architecture, and then continue to code. Yeah. And the
All right.
reason, also
Yeah.
going back to your original question about why is it important? Why do we need to work on front architecture? And that's just the reason that we can ask the same question for software architecture in general, because
Yeah.
your software, your front end, your back end, or whatever is the software you're building, it will have an architecture, no matter if you try to define it in the beginning or not. So you might define your architecture and choose your own architecture, or your architecture will choose you. Like it will
Yeah.
just emerge from the decisions that you make while writing the code. And in the end, it's just about being able to manage complexity as the project continues to grow. With a well-defined architecture, you're just able to grow the project in a much more scalable way. More people can contribute to the same code base if your architecture is well defined and modularized and so on. But if you don't spend the time to think about the architecture and just start writing the code directly, chances are that as the project continues to grow, more people jump into the project, then you're going to start stepping into each other's toes. You're going to start doing a lot of rework, refactoring, and so on. So architecture is just one way to help you down the line to scale your code base better.
All right. Cool, cool, cool. Okay, yeah. So speaking about scaling, right? I think what do you think about front end architecture in the essence of that has to do with scaling, maintenance, and should I say performance, right?
Hmm.
Because so what part does front end architecture play actually in this? Because as you said earlier, you could build different applications and they have different needs, right?
Hmm.
But all the application we get to build most times, or we get to push out to the market, or push out to to the web mostly, you always want to
Hmm.
go for the best performance, the best application you could scale in case of
Hmm.
like maybe you have more traffic and more users in the future. So like how does front end architecture comes into play in this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this absolutely. This comes back to what we were previously talking to about quality attributes, which are all these things you were mentioning: performance, scalability, maintainability,
Yeah.
reliability, and so on. So all of these are things that we always want more of, right? We always want
Mm.
more performance. We
Yeah.
always want to build the
Yeah.
app that is more scalable.
Yeah.
We're never gonna say, oh, I don't want my app to be super scalable. I do, like, we always want all of these things to
Yeah.
be the greatest possible. But architecture is also about realizing that there are always going to be trade-offs, and then in a lot of cases you will have to choose, like, do you want to
Mm.
move super fast, or do you want to move slower but on a more scalable way, for example? That's just one question comes to mind. And architecture, what lets you do is it helps you define which are the things that are more important for your particular project and for your particular team and for the product that you're building. For example, performance is always something that comes to mind, and we always want the best performance, but not
Exactly.
all applications have the same performance need. Some
Mm-hmm.
applications, if
Mm-hmm.
it's something that if it's an app that it's going to be used a lot on mobile devices, on slow connections, then it's going to have more performance needs than an app that is mostly used on desktop devices where people are
Exactly.
connected to Wi-Fi, for example, right? So in those two cases, you might prioritize performance differently, and that will help you make certain decisions about your product. So in the case of the super performant application, then maybe you don't want to go with a framework that or like a client's rendered single page application, because that typically ends up shipping a lot of JavaScript to the client, and it
To the
has to
browser.
render
Yeah.
on
To the
the
browser.
client and so on. It has to
Yeah.
render on the browser. So that's going to be probably slower than if you go with something that maybe renders on the server and just
Mm-hmm.
ships HTML to the browser. So that will let you make those decisions about which frameworks you choose.
All right. All right. Okay. Cool. So right now, I just want to go into a more to talk about visualizing front end architecture, right? Because there isn't we can't have this discussion without going into it, right? Because if for people that are looking out to start out maybe getting an interest in front end architecture, now,
Hmm.
um, there's a I won't call it a different part, but like there's a part I just want us to have a discussion around. So visualizing your front end architecture. Now we've talked about what front end architecture is, why do we need it,
Hmm.
and like the importance of why you need front end architecture and how you could like get started in and front end
Hmm.
architecture. Yeah. So like I just want us to talk about visualizing front end architecture because in my head right now, like I think from your articles, you could basically call it the map of your code, right? So
Hmm.
how your particular code is mapped or the map that represents the code. So I just want us to talk about that. So first off, what is the purpose? What is the purpose of visualizing? Because what is the purpose of visualizing your architecture and why is it important to us as front end engineers? Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So the main purpose is to be able to better understand the architecture and to communicate the architecture to other people as well, right? Because let's say you want to explain how your Next.js code base works. One option is to have someone go through the entire code base and read through the code, just check out all the folders that they have and all these different things, and check out the APIs that they call, or the databases that you use, and so on. But that will take a long time. So if
Quite
you want to
stressful.
provide yeah, that's just brings up a lot of questions as well. So if you want to provide a good way to share that how your architecture looks like, the best way is with a diagram, right? You want to draw a high level diagram instead of having your application as an entire code base. It's just a box in the middle of the diagram, right? And there are different ways to do that. Architectural diagrams are typically boxes and arrows of different types. But
Yeah,
the model that I recommend that I like to use is a model called C4 model, which
C4.
C4 is a very popular model for visualizing architecture, and it's developed by a software architect called Simon Brown, and it's essentially
Yes,
four levels of different types of diagrams. Each level
yes,
gives you the architecture at a different level of abstraction or a different level of detail. So in the first
correct.
level, you have the entire system context, which is a very high level diagram when you can't even see the applications at that level. You only see external systems and the users. Then when you zoom in a level into level two, you see the container diagram, and that's what all your containers are. Which in your containers are essentially any applications or APIs or databases that you may have. And then
Yeah,
you can zoom into a particular container and you will see the components of that container, which are might be like controllers or classes and so on. And then when you zoom into that, you'll see the code diagrams, right? And that's usually like class diagrams and these low level type of diagrams. So you typically only need levels 1 and 2. Levels 3 and 4 are not as commonly used because they are so close to the code that they change very frequently. So there's no point in maintaining this type of diagrams in a lot of cases. So for documentation purposes, levels 1 and 2 are probably the most useful.
all right, all right. Okay, cool. So, I think you quite did justice to that question because you mentioned a tool which you use for visualizing our architecture, and I think you
Hmm.
mentioned C4 model, which is you
Hmm.
said very popular and yeah, quite very useful. And you mentioned four types, right? Four types
Hmm.
of diagram that are mostly used, and you mentioned the system context, which you said like the overall
Yep.
view. Then when you zoom in, you get to see the container diagram, then components, then the code. Um,
Hmm.
Now you said components, right? And remember, we are on the front end, like we're discussing on the
Yeah.
front end. And are you referring to components UI or like is that a different terminology? Like, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I recommend that. I wrote this article that talks about visualizing, and for front end systems in particular, I like to make some modifications to those level 3 and 4.
yeah,
The components, I like to, instead of breaking down in components, I like to call them modules. And
yeah.
for these modules, there's also, it's not just one of the reasons is what you said. We typically use the word component to refer to UI components like React components or Vue components. So it might be confusing to refer to these modules as components as well. So I just refer them to them as modules. And also that there is a slight difference for me in terms of what do they mean between the components and modules, which is that components typically refer to some sort of entity of your system. For example, you might have a customer's controller that is a component, right? In the case you're dealing with customers. But you won't always have like a customer module in your application because the way that I like to break down these modules are by taking a look at the routes in your URLs, right? So if you have
Okay,
a profile that is your website.com/profile, then you're probably going to have a profile module, right?
okay,
And so on, like depending on the app that you're building. Let's say you're building an app for restaurants, that you might have like a restaurant/ID type of URL, and that will represent the restaurant module and so on. So these are typically these top level routes of your application are represented by modules. And then at level 4, which is the code level in the C4 model. In C4, they recommend you, or you typically see code diagrams like class diagrams and so on. But for
mm-hmm.
front end systems in particular, what I like to have at the level are UI breakdowns, like component breakdowns of the UI. So you have a screenshot
Okay,
of your Figma designs, for example, and break it them down into what different components you might have, like drawing boxes around different sections of your UI and saying, oh, this is this is the sidebar component, or this is the header component, and so on.
All right, all right. Okay, cool, cool, cool. So I think right now one more question that just popped up in my head right now is why creating the front end architecture, right? Or I won't call it the front end architecture right now because of how I want to structure this question right now. So if, for example, a team, right, a team that comprises of the back end engineers, the and the front end engineers, right, and also the designers, for example, the product team. So how will you advise this particular architecture needs, like, how does it needs to be created? Because now, based on the C4 model, right, based on the C4 model, you mentioned the system context diagram. So the system context
Hmm.
diagram, which is like the overview level, and the system context
Hmm.
diagram is, based on what I understand by it, right, is you basically just see different containers, right, and it's just boxes and different okay, now let me put it into context. For example, you're building an application, right? Let's say maybe an e-commerce application, right?
Hmm.
We talk about the system context diagram. We're talking about the overview of how the backend connects to the front end. The front end connects to every other part. That is the system context, right?
Hmm.
The overview of the whole code base. So now, remember, we're talking about front end architecture. So how can the front end engineers, for example, create such an architecture? Because they don't have access, most times they might not really have access to the backend code bases or to the
Hmm.
backend structure, because maybe they have different teams. They don't have like full stack engineers on the team. So like how you advise such front end developers to collaborate with the other team members to create such high level diagram? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially for these two levels, the level one and level two of the C4 model, the ones that are presented this overview of the system. Yeah, you definitely want to collaborate with other people in the team to come up with this vision, because these two levels are definitely not specific to front end architecture. These are very much general
Yeah.
software architecture diagrams. In the container diagram, for example, you might see your front end application as a box in the
Mm-hmm.
diagram, but it's just one of the boxes. You will see connections to all of the other containers in your diagrams, which might include your databases, your APIs, your any other external systems that you may be using. For example, let's say your API is using Stripe to manage payments,
Yeah.
then you that is not something that belongs in your within the responsibilities of your team, but it should still be a box represented in your diagram, because you need to understand that you're using this Stripe system to make payments. So the way that you get that knowledge is by talking to people. So you want to collaborate with your data engineers, your backend engineers, and your team. Among all of you, put together all of the pieces, right? It's like putting together a puzzle, and you just need
Yeah.
every person on the team has different pieces. So you want to collaborate together. If you are physically like co-located, you want to get on next to a whiteboard and start writing them on it, or if you can do like a virtual one as well. But yeah, that's the way that I
Mm-hmm.
recommend it. Get together with a few people on your team from these different disciplines, and yeah, try to come up with the best possible representation that you can of your architecture.
So can you just share with us some best practices, right? And
Hmm.
I think I'll call them common best practices we could use to create architectural diagrams, right? What are the best practices? What are the best method to actually do this? Because now, why I'm asking this question is because there's really a thin line between doing too much and doing like nothing at the same time when it comes to like architecture. So like what are the common practices? Can you just give us some tips or some point of like, okay, this is what you need to do when you're creating your diagrams. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to create this. This is what you need to do, like to make the diagram more useful and clear. Yeah, can you just share
Hmm.
some tips here?
Yeah. So I definitely recommend checking out the c4model.com website that has a lot of the
Yeah.
information about the C4 model for doing these diagrams. Some of the best practices are making it clear that what each of your boxes and arrows in your diagrams represent. So one big thing in C4 is that your boxes not only have a label saying that this is a web app, for example, they also have a small description of what the web app is doing. And then your arrows are not just an arrow connecting two boxes in the diagram, but they also have some sort of action that say this API writes from or reads to this database. You actually see what the connection is, and you just make it clear for people who are reading the diagram. Because remember that this is all about communication. These diagrams are not just for
Yeah.
you, but for other people who maybe you're onboarding someone who is new to your team and I want to say, oh, how does the architecture of this software works? They will probably try to look at the diagram and try to understand as much as possible. So that level of detail is important, but you also don't want to go into so much detail that it's just very hard to understand. For example, your component diagram, which is level 3, which is your controllers and your classes and so on. You don't want to include all of your controllers of your application,
Okay.
right? You don't want to
Okay.
include all of your classes. It would be like creating a diagram in a front end project that has all of your functions that you use in your
Wow.
right. Like it would be really hard to understand. So you want to focus on the main
Yeah.
ones, which are the main classes of your program, the main controllers and so on. So yeah, it's a hard balance because on the one hand you want to provide as much detail as possible so that it's clear at the first glance what the diagram is, but at the same time you don't want to provide so much detail that it's just overwhelming.
All right. All right. All right. Cool. So
Mhm.
I think the right question, the next question mostly, I just want to ask is, I think it has to do with what we just discussed right now, but it's more like what is actually the like at what point, right, when you're trying to build that architecture, your front on the front end, and you're trying to build out the front end architecture, at what point do you realize that it's too much or too little, right?
Mhm.
Because you should be able to differentiate when you're doing too much, right? And when you're doing too much architecture or when you're doing too little. So like,
Mhm.
what can you say about that? Like, at what point could it, like, for example, a team lead overseeing the other front end developers, right? And is the one hand he or she um they are handling the front end architecture, and they are iterating as they go on, and as the particular build that product. So like, what is the right balance? Yeah, I think that's the word. What is the right
Mhm.
balance between too much and too little
Yeah.
architecture? Yeah.
Yeah, that's another great question. It's also one of the hardest things to get right because there's no one size fit all answer for this type of question. Unfortunately, so it will really depend on
Yeah.
your project. And there was some research done a few years ago. With someone just asking this question, like how much architecture do I need to avoid rework in the future? But at the same
Okay.
time, that is not so much that I'm spending just all this time in architecture. And the consequence of the research was it was very tied to your how big you think the project is going to be. And in this case, big was determined by lines of code. So if your project is uh, you know 1,000 lines of code, you probably don't need too much architecture. If a
Mm-hmm.
project is going to be um, you know 10 million lines of code, then you probably need a bit more than that. So that's also it's hard to tell how big your project is going to be from the beginning. So it's also a very hard to follow rule. But I like what Simon Brown also has to say on this topic, and he's the author of the C4 model the diagrams that we were talking about recently. And
Yeah.
he says that you don't want to do these big upfront designs that will be doing too much, right? You don't want to design the entire architecture from the beginning, but you also don't want to do too little that you don't know what you're doing. Like you're just writing code hoping that a good architecture will emerge. So what he recommends is to do just a bit of upfront design and then stop when you understand what the problem is that you're solving. What are your main drivers? Like we were talking about, do you care more about performance? Do you care more about scalability? Do you care
Stability.
more
Yeah.
about agility and moving fast? Is moving fast one of your main drivers, or is more important that you move a bit slower and you go in a scalable way, right? Once you define which are the things that are important for your application, and once you come up with a solution that you think will solve that problem, then you can stop. You can stop and you can start coding. right? And then iterate on that every sprint, every other sprint, or whatever cycles you want to use. Go back, define a bit more of the architecture, continue coding, and so on. Like, as always, trying to incorporate the feedback from your coding journey back into the architecture. That is also like there's this discipline called evolutionary architecture, which talks about this. Not an architecture that is
Okay.
defined from the beginning, but something that evolves with the code base. As your
With
code base
time.
continues
Yeah.
to evolve, your architecture will continue to evolve as well. So yeah, that will be my main recommendation. Do as little as possible, as long as you know that you met your requirements, that you know what your requirements are, and then start coding. There's one thing. There's also one thing I like to say about decisions. As we talked about earlier, a lot of your work, if you work on architecture, you'll have to make decisions. You have to decide
Yeah.
which framework you want to use, which patterns you want to follow, which practices you like to incorporate, and so on. You don't have to make every decision upfront. You want to avoid trying to make every decision upfront. Instead, you want to choose. There's this principle that's called the last responsible moment principle, which means delaying the decision to as late as possible. To as long as
Mm.
it's responsible to do so, you want to delay your decision and make it at the last responsible moment, because that will be the
Okay.
moment where you have the more information to make that decision.
That's really quite amazing, and you broke it. You really gave like a broad understanding and um, how you could choose when to stop or when to continue when go into the question and answers.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
yeah, quickly go into the question and answers because yeah, I had one question from LinkedIn,
Hmm.
and the question actually has to do with monorepo and
Yeah.
micro frontend architecture. It says, okay, monorepo or polyrepo in a micro frontend architecture.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say that it depends, because it's always going to depend on a lot of different things. But
Okay.
not knowing anything else about this particular project, I would recommend a monorepo for not just for micro frontends, but for really a lot of different projects. I think monorepo has a lot of advantages, and these days the monorepo tooling is very good. We have all this. Recently, did a migration in my company at from using polyrepos to using this monorepo, and we use turbo repo with remote cache functionality, and that the tooling is very good. It helps you save time during CI builds and so on. So I highly recommend like going with a monorepo by default for almost every project, particularly front end for micro front ends. I think it's also more especially important because a lot of the times your different micro front ends will depend on each other, right? And so sometimes you might
Exactly.
have to release sometimes you might have to release a change that requires that you to ship different micro front ends, not just one micro front end, but I have to update my sidebar and my contact page, my content micro front end, and so on. And if you have them all in different repos, then there's going to be a lot of overhead in, I have to coordinate all of these releases to make them at the same time. But if they're in the mono repo, yeah, you can just make them in one go. Like at the same PR, you change all of the things you want to change, and then you release all of the ones. So yeah, I think for micro frontends particularly, I would recommend a mono repo.
All right. All right. All right. Quite insightful. Cool. I think you could quickly just give us an overview because I think you mentioned about the workshop, the
Yeah.
front end architecture workshop you've been working on, and I've really been looking forward to that. And yeah, I don't know, like you could just give us an overview of what that is and how soon would that be 100% done? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm working on this course, which is I'm calling it a course now because I was using the word workshop before, and some
Yeah.
people thought it was gonna be like a live workshop, like in
Oh,
person
oh,
or online live workshop. So I say I'm gonna call it a course, but I sometimes still refer to as a workshop, which I know is
yeah.
confusing. But yeah, we're talking about the same thing. But yeah, this is a free, absolutely free course that I've been working on for quite a few months now, and it's called Fundamentals of Front-End Architecture. It's pretty much everything that I know of front-end architecture, and just put together in a course format. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about in this episode are the things that I cover in that workshop, in that course. If I didn't make any sense, if what what I was talking about seemed like too high level and didn't make too much sense, I promise that in the course it will make more sense. But I will talk in more detail about a lot of these things. So yeah, and it's essentially divided into different modules. One of them is about understanding problems. The other one is about actually designing the architecture. So we'll see how to start to break down the application into different modules. And the last one is about implementation, which is about actually grabbing the architecture that you defined in the previous modules and then translating that into actual code. So we'll see also how a lot of these concepts that we'll be talking about, like modules and entities and so on, how do they actually look like in the code once you translated them into the implementation. Um, so yeah, I'm working on that. Past few weeks, I've been doing a big push to try to get it done. I
Yeah.
hope that this week I plan to release the early access to the course, which is going to include the majority of the contents, and then maybe next week or the following one, I plan to release the entire thing. And as I mentioned earlier, it's free. It's free for everyone. So yeah, feel free
Yeah.
to subscribe to the newsletter if you want to check it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool, 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 cool. Definitely. Looking forward to the workshop or the course, whichever you call it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely looking forward towards it. Yeah. So I think we'll actually over we've overspent our time, but like I just want you to just give us a quick final thoughts on architecture advice. Just 1 minute, like just 1 minute
Yeah.
final thoughts and advice on architecture on the front end. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So my advice for anyone who's interested in architecture, especially for front end developers who might be interested in architecture, is to, like I mentioned earlier, spend some time trying to develop your breadth of knowledge, which means going out of your comfort zone and don't stick like too much to the front end layer. It's okay, like, and it's good that your expertise is on the front end layer and JavaScript and React, but you also want to get a good understanding of the rest of how the web works, right? You want to know, like you were mentioning earlier, you want to know your fundamentals. You want to know how a server works. You want to know how a database works. So trying to get an understanding of that will help you just have a lot more context, and then by the time you start to working on architectural things, that all that context will be useful because you will have to make decisions not just about your front end but about other things as well. And I think this is something that it's becoming also increasingly important, even if you don't want to be an architect. If you're a front end developer right now,
Mm-hmm.
most modern frameworks are starting to incorporate more and more backend layers. Like the line between backend and front end is getting even blurry.
Yeah.
Every day it's
Yeah.
getting more blurry. So now you might even be required at your next job to know how a particular database works or how an
Correct.
API server works. So going out of your comfort zone and just getting familiar with all those backend data topics, that will be my main recommendation.
All right. Amazing advice. So I think um where can we find more information, more resources? I think the number one place I would say is your newsletter, Frontend at Scale. Yeah,
Hmm.
so like is there any other resources out there? I think you mentioned a system design book. Yeah, but like if you just give us some resources or information, we could go out there and like for people that are interested to advance their knowledge on front end architecture and software designs. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, where to find me? My newsletter, frontendatscale.com, is probably the best place. I send an email every 2 weeks with
Yeah.
usually an essay on some topic about software design or architecture, and some resources as well. I always share in my favorite talks and books and podcasts that I listen to. So, yeah, definitely check that out. I'm on social media. You can find me as Maxi Ferreira. There is one soccer player that is called Maxi Ferreira. So if you Google Maxi Ferreira and see a soccer player, that's not me. I'm terrible at
Okay.
soccer.
Okay.
Um, but I'm the other one. I'm the other Maxi Ferreira, and you can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. My my nickname, my username is typically Charka in those networks. So
Okay.
you might find me at twitter.com/Charka, for example. And Yeah, and about resources. Well, my like I said earlier, I love reading books. So my main type of advice will be to read books, especially if you're interested in architecture. For architecture books, I have a new favorite that I don't have it here right now, but it's a Head First Software Architecture book. It was released
Mm-hmm.
this year, and it's essentially modern version of the fundamentals of software architecture book, which was my previous favorite introductory book to architecture. So Head First Software
Okay.
Architecture, highly recommend that one if you're looking for a good introduction to architecture. That's probably one of the best reads. And for software design, my number one recommendation is A Philosophy of Software Design by John Osterhout. That's one of my favorite technical books overall. So I highly recommend that one. It's very short. It's a very short book. Has a lot of practical advice, and it will just help you think about complexity in a completely different way. So I highly recommend checking that out too.
All right, cool, definitely. I think I'll keep a link to your blog and those resources you just mentioned in the video
Yeah.
description for people that are interested to check them out. Yeah, I think we've come to the end of this particular episode, and we've really talked a lot of things about front-end architecture, a lot of insights, a lot of information from Maxi. I don't know. Thank you for doing this, and yeah, hopefully people get an interest on front-end architecture and go out there and build amazing applications. Yeah,
Awesome. Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you,
Thank
and
you. Yeah. Thank you for
bye,
having me.
guys.
This
Yeah,
was it was
yeah, bye.
all right. Bye.